Hello, so my name's Kyle and today I'm going to talk to you a bit about level design. I did a fairly similar talk for Games Talk Live back in May, but it was very introductory. It was basically like a level design 101 with some brief insights from myself. That was a fairly short talk, but I can spend a bit more time today talking about the same subject, but this time taking it one step further. So we'll do a very quick version of my previous talk so people are up to speed, and then I'm going to talk a bit more about authenticity against gameplay. Just like Games Talk Live, I've got a wee script that I'm going to stick very closely with, so I hit all the points that I want to hit. So a wee bit of background about myself. I'm a game, level and mission designer who has now been in the industry professionally for roughly 3.5 years. However, I've been involved in the industry for roughly 5 in total, as I was very fortunate to have a QA work placement with Blazing Griffin that slowly blossomed into a junior design position where I worked on the Poirot games. I then joined Ubisoft Reflections down in Newcastle as a level designer, where I worked on Assassin's Creed Nexus, to finally find my home back in Glasgow again at NoCode as a designer, where I do game and mission design too, but predominantly take responsibility for the level design of Silent Hill Townfall. I also joined BAFTA last month, which was really cool, and I'm hoping this is the start of me giving back to more to the industry between talks, workshops, uni events, all that kind of stuff. I've had the pleasure of working with different studios, teams and games, all of which use a very different level design approach. So what is level design? So back in May I searched on Google definitions of level design and picked a few from the first 4 or so links. Most commonly we think of level design as creating the physical space that the game takes place in. Maybe the most commonly referred to one. Sometimes definitions like the next one take it one step further and mention things contained within the levels too that have an effect on the player experience, such as mechanics, interactions, etc. Then you get definitions that imply the effects it has on player emotions and how it influences the player too, such as these last 2 definitions here. Now I'm going to do the very designery wishy-washy thing here and say that I believe level design is actually all of these things. Different people from different backgrounds with different experience levels, and from different studios may see level design as a completely different thing. It's ultimately very hard to give one clear and broad definition that caters to all games and ideologies, but based on my experience I'm going to give it a try. So I believe that level design is the iterative game design process of ensuring all of a game's features and mechanics complement the player aesthetic through the in-game world, or something to that effect. Bit vague, but I truly think there's a reason for that. You don't have one clear task within the project as a level designer. You're effectively the stakeholder for the game to ensure the levels of the game are fun and do their intended purpose. You oversee arguably the most immersive aspect of your game to the player, ensuring the connection to the magic circle isn't broken through inconceivable, boring or frustrating means. Similar to how we interpret definitions of level design, there are different responsibilities depending on the different team size and genres of your game. I've tried to summarise what I believe a dedicated level designer broadly oversees. Crafting and iterating upon the playable space within the game with blockout tools or placeholder assets. Yep, arguably the most common one. This is the play space, the world in which the player will be in. Sometimes people use floor plans too to detail our rooms and spaces before jumping into the engine. Some don't. Naughty Dog apparently don't do that, but that works for them. The key thing here though is iteration. You will iterate on your levels all the time, or at least you should be. Implementing the engaging or interactive areas that allow the players to utilise the mechanics and rules of the game. These include things like interaction zones, things the player can do, enemies and patrols to take out, unique traversal opportunities, etc. Basically the ingredients or toys of your level, and you would need to ensure they're discernible enough to the player too. Creating and maintaining level design documentation such as LDDs or MDDs, fun. The reason why this is here is because I would actually say I spend just about most of my time in documentation. This includes research, outlines or level details for all departments, justifications for ideas and what the level contains. Ensuring the intended player emotions are met at the points we hope for them to be invoked. It's low-hanging fruit, but for example, think of horror games. For the moments we want players to feel anxious, creeped out, scared. How do we invoke that through our levels for players to still feel engaged? Cater to all play styles, player personas and experience levels so a wider range of people can enjoy your game. Personas can be seen as one big umbrella for how a player will play your game in its entirety. A good example is Bartel's player types for gamification, with players broken down to 4 categories, all of which detail subtle goals or influences that each player type might have when playing your game. Marry your world to architecture or artist techniques, basically ensuring that the levels you are building are conceivable, I'll come back to this, and are fun to navigate from the context of the world. Applying rules such as the rules of free, leading lines, verticality, composition or framing, etc. But merging them with the structures and landscape of your game. Finally, and maybe most importantly, ensure your levels marry to other disciplines within the game world, including art, UI, audio, lighting and narrative. Everything needs to work together to achieve the same vision. Consider all departments as even the slightest addition or change to your levels can greatly impact the workload or scope of your departments. Your level can be seen as like a melting pot for everybody's hard work, so every single discipline must be taken into consideration. There's a great talk from Dana Nightingale of Arcane Leon where she discusses that level design truly is a studio-wide effort. Now, a good friend of mine is getting into game dev, and he asked me a few questions when it comes to the design of games. We even did a game jam back in January, so for him to understand what goes into game dev and the knock-on effects of game design decisions. But to give clarity for what game dev or level design is, I sent him this video, and I'd like to show you all today. I'm going to try this.
When we want to get something in the game as simple as Kratos, the main character, goes up to a giant column in the world and grabs it, and then when the player rapidly presses the circle button, he's going to be able to go, like pull on it, and then successfully pull the column down while the column breaks and shatters. There's enemies on top of it that end up falling and dying. Just that one sequence alone, you have to involve the level guys, because they basically have to create the space in which it takes place in. Those level guys will also be modeling the column. Animation has to wait until that column gets designed. Then effects have to get put on it. Then a designer has to put it in and attach it to the buttons. And then a sound person has to come in and attach the sounds on top of that. If any special code has to get done, meaning a tool needs to get written in order to get this to happen, code has to be notified early on. Almost every single department has their hands on this thing, and this is a thing that could, basically take up a minute of gameplay.
So, to try and rationalise my definition and all the points I've said above, I believe level design is actually game design. You're responsible for establishing a cooperative relationship between all areas of the game, which are then presented to the player. You're maintaining the vision of the game, similar to game design, but through the levels and the overarching world. Now, to go back to that very first definition, it said usually first or third-person shooters, and whilst that isn't incorrect, levels are much more than just 3D linear or multiplayer experiences, as you can imagine. We can have open world areas with encampments that players can liberate, such as enemy bases in Assassin's Creed. We can have levels like in Resident Evil, where as the player progresses and gets new skills or tools, the level evolves and becomes more explorative. We of course can have 2D games that still aim to accomplish the same thing using core mechanics or influencing techniques to encourage player movement or agency. There we go. And finally, I think you can make an argument that any play space can be considered a level, even dedicated and unique spaces such as these. You aren't traversing anywhere, but you are using the mechanics and rules that the game have supplied to the player to overcome challenges or puzzles that the levels provide. It isn't just 3D spaces. Now that I've given you the rough definition of level design, I'm going to discuss the challenge of authenticity and gameplay. I wanted to base my talk not only around designing playable spaces, but how a good balance of real-world context and in-game rules, authenticity and gameplay, should motivate your levels. For the remaining section of this talk, I'll mainly refer to games that are more ingrained with real worlds, actions or stories, but could still have fantastical, abstract or sci-fi elements to them too. Games that have an influence from some aspect of realism, and presumably use more relatable camera perspectives that put the players in the shoes of the playable character. For example, first-person shooters like Call of Duty and Rainbow Six, they're games that aim to be true to life with their mechanics, narrative and levels. But we can also have Halo and Fallout that, although aren't true to life for their time period or world conflict, they may take some inspiration in some plausible way from the real world with weaponry, locations from the real world, amongst other subtle things. In some form or another, these types of games that my talks pertain to are to ones that have some relation or context to the real world through its levels. Between Spider-Man using literal spaces like Manhattan and New York, or to God of War using Nordic architecture and landscapes. Hopefully you understand. So before I can discuss the challenge, I'm going to do the very annoying thing here and define things first, mainly gameplay. So I kind of alluded to or implied what gameplay is in my talk, but for reaffirmation, I'll quickly go over what I believe it to be from a game dev standpoint. Merriam-Webster defines the gameplay as the characteristic way in which action of a game, such as a video game, occurs or is experienced. Basically, it's the rules, mechanics, or interactable content of your game. Players use these mechanics to utilise gameplay, which should reinforce the core loop of the game. If your game has a loop similar to the Borderlands franchise, where you enter an enemy camp, you kill enemies, you loot containers, and retrieve the big reward at the end, then you best be sure that there is guns, chests, and a level to provide that exact type of gameplay. Simply put, gameplay is what the player does within the game world based on the tools and interactions at their disposal. As a level designer, your job is not only to make sure your spaces accommodate the gameplay, but it complements it too. So what about authenticity? So authenticity is essentially the ability to invoke emotions through association, how accurate something is when compared to a real-world counterpart. A definition found from Merriam-Webster again simply just says it's not false or imitation. Imitation is a great word here to use because you aren't directly replicating layouts for your levels. You are creating believable spaces that follow or are inspired by the same structure. This quote doesn't even apply to just games. I feel it can be applied to all media. There's a reason why certain elements in movies, shows, books, etc. resonate with people at a personal level. Not only are we familiar with the content of it, but there's usually an emotional response to it too. So now let's try and bring these two together. To rationalise the term authenticity in games, Infospedia defines it as focusing on utilising real-world knowledge, as opposed to fiction, as a means to achieve engagement, as well as promote the learning of the artefacts or knowledge. It's a bit wordy, but this is basically just merging both of these previous definitions together. Game developers should be taking genuine elements from the real-world context to design and craft their games. The reason why this quote is important is the keyword engagement, which is what all designers should really strive for when it comes to the content we produce. Given the player familiarity with what the play space is allows them to engage with their game more at a personal level, because they have expectations, I'll come back to this, of what they will experience. In some cases, the level of the authenticity can even do some heavy lifting for narrative through environmental storytelling, or just generally with the ingredients or the tools or the toys that your unique spaces offer when it comes to level design. So for example, in Dishonored, there's a heavy focus on verticality, with players using this feature for traversal and stealth. It creates challenge and variety of gameplay. However, it also represents the contrast between the poor and the rich of the game. Subtly, or maybe not, depends how you perceived it, but the game uses European architecture techniques to distinguish between the financial and economical classes of the game world. Rats are literally present on the ground floor in most of these worlds, and then obviously the rooms and like the halls and stuff are more grand when they're more higher up in the game world. Ian Donald and Andrew Reid of Abertay University up in Dundee stated in their paper, The Wild West, Accuracy and Authenticity and Gameplay in Red Dead Redemption 2, that authenticity is about creating a feeling for the gameplay experience that feels correct in order to be immersed. Immersion is another contributing factor as to how players maintain flow and engagement through your game. Players will typically not want to be taken out of the experience, and the more that the aesthetic of your level looks like the real-world counterpart, and it allows for more immersion and in turn more engaging gameplay, the player will feel that they're more present in the moment. Authenticity in your games can be powerful and key to great game design, but especially with level and narrative design too. Again, notice how both these quotes don't explicitly say to aim for realism. The first one actually says opposed to fiction, because developers shouldn't strive for their game to be as realistic as possible. In many ways, your game can't be realistic, and you really shouldn't aim for that either. Taking any realistic shooter, for example, and I understand this is grasping at straws here, but firing a shotgun would most likely recoil and push you back a great deal. Running away for even a wee bit won't bring you back to full health if you've been shot 4 times. From a level design standpoint, it's even very unrealistic to have certain rooms like an armory be just completely open and accessible without keys, codes or key cards, which some games do freely have open, by the way. These are very obvious and comically bad examples, but I hope you get my point, because there are far more subtle and not so subtle examples that are littered across the games that we all love. The difference between authenticity and realism is where realism aims to emulate exactly how things are in real life, authenticity just needs to sell you on the idea of it being in real life, and you feel it to be true. To round this slide up, when there's a real-life connection or understanding from the player, and if done so effectively, they are more likely to be engaged and immersed. Players will only care about realism if it adds something to the experience without hurting the core loop of the game. I might regret this if nobody gets it, but I took 4 games that share the same real-world location. None of the places in these photos are real places, but they are from the same real-world location. But I'm hoping that the level design and environment artist sold you on where the location is. Does anybody know where this is?
Sky.
Where?
Sky.
I'll take that. It's Scotland. So yeah. So I hope, yeah. Yeah. So that's apparently supposed to be Sky from Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Uncharted 4, don't know where that is exactly. And again, oil rigs, and that's from DRS for there. That's from Still Wakes the Deep. So yeah. So like I say, I hope you get the point, and I hope that covers what authenticity in games actually is. So now to the challenge. The challenge, I feel, is that where we want to apply authenticity to our spaces, or we want to offer the player a specific experience through gameplay. Oh, 2 seconds. There we go. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes one needs to be sacrificed, even just a little. The reason why this can be an issue is because, as with game dev, when one thing slowly starts to take priority, the other feature or pillar of your game slowly starts to not take such precedence. If the gameplay is at the forefront of your design, which it usually is, then authenticity starts to become more flexible. When this happens, a couple of issues can arise, mainly consistency and spuriousness, or inauthenticity. This isn't exclusively about authenticity, but a good example for when things in game dev are sacrificed or loses priority is in the Wolfenstein New Colossus. With the game having 3 core pillars of mayhem, tactical and stealth, the developers openly admitted that they slowly started to take their focus away from stealth, not spending enough time refining it. This is why the game doesn't offer consistent stealth opportunities across its levels, and AI can react inauthentically when trying to do so. So how does the challenge of authenticity in gameplay apply to level design? So more than likely, the closest connection to both of these that is supplied to the player is the levels of your game. Like I said before, it is arguably the most immersive aspect of your game. It's where all of the elements from each discipline of your team come together to create the authentic worlds that we all consume. The challenge isn't for when we want to apply authenticity, it's about doing it effectively and consistently. I believe there's an unwritten rule or mutual agreement between the game and the player for what they should expect from a visual and gameplay standpoint. Players from the offset should understand gameplay mechanics as well as authenticity of the game worlds. There's nothing wrong if things aren't exactly true to life with their counterpart. However, if the player's engagement and state of flow are affected by this, then it can be seen as immersion breaking. Applying it, though, isn't even just as simple as it sounds. As a level designer, I'm constantly looking for reference for the games I'm designing, creating collages in Miro to ensure that not only does the layouts and architecture align with the blockouts that I have, but also the tone and overall aesthetic too. Like I said, as a designer, I spend a lot of time in documentation. Depending on the project, you'll be surprised at how much authenticity gets brought up in development, especially at the development stage of the game. So whether implicit or explicit, and to be honest, it probably should be as well. Calling back to the definitions at the very start, different departments and different divisions may dictate how far the authenticity goes in your game, especially to help with budget and time. So these issues need to be addressed in the production stage one way or another. Let's quickly talk about the issue of consistency. So an article by Anton Temba from the website Game Developer talks about consistency in games, where he states that consistency is about organising the game and its mechanics that it all works seamlessly together as logically as possible. This makes the game feel natural, everything makes sense. The big reason why consistency across levels must be maintained is because all the rules are established here for the player. If something doesn't seem to fit within the game, it truly can take the player out of the experience. Taking subtle liberties here and there for the sake of gameplay is usually fine. However, if things start to go against the core gameplay loop or become so detached to what the level layouts and architecture are, then immersion is almost sure to break. Consistency needs to be maintained at all times for numerous different reasons, but especially for level design. To quote Richard Atlas's blog post in Game Developer, a blog post called "Is there anything more important than the game's consistency?" He says, "A rule that has been established and conveyed to the player cannot be broken by the game. Otherwise, the game risks losing consistency. If the player can always grab ledges in a platformer, then there shouldn't be similar-looking ledges that can't be grabbed. We teach our players the rules of the universe in many ways, and if we ever contradict the rules that we establish, or the rules that the players believe we have established, then we break the immersion and we create a bad experience for players." And he ends the quote by saying, "Player expectations are created by consistency, and those expectations are shattered by inconsistent marketing and game design. They will lead to a bad experience." To give further example, this initially started as a silly conversation in work, on the works night out, but it applies here. If you establish that, this is just an example, if you establish that in the interior buildings of your game have toilets, cool, that is authentic. If you establish that you find bandages within first aid boxes in these toilets for the interior buildings, then great, that's something that the player can rely on and get used to when it comes to challenging parts of the game. However, if you then have even one building later on in the game that follows the same rules and layout approach and accommodates gameplay similar to every other part of the game, but has no toilets, then when it really should, players will notice this and can become quite frustrated. Player expectations are something I'll come back to, but hopefully these examples paint the picture. As the slide suggests, consistency is key when it comes to level design, but more importantly, game design as a whole. Establishing rules early and maintaining them throughout the course of the game is imperative to forming that connection and trust with the player. If consistency of the level design content and authenticity is at a high mark, the mutual agreement between the game and the player will rarely, if at all, break. I've got a funny picture here. There we go. Go back there we go. It's rare that there are some severe cases of games being inauthentic, right? So much so that it takes the player out of the experience. We have all heard from the term ludonarrative dissonance, where narrative and gameplay don't align and can cause immersion breaking issues for the player. But we don't have a term for when gameplay, narrative, and the level don't align. Or at least I couldn't find any. It might be a branch of ludonarrative dissonance or just fall under that umbrella anyway. But relating back to consistency, very quickly, one thing that is seen as quite essential is the establishment of rules in the game world. What the player can expect from gameplay and the narrative in the game's universe. I mention this because even if a game's rules are very obscure and have very little relatable qualities to the real world, like take this for example, as long as it's consistent, it's usually fine. Similar to when a game is inconsistent, when a level proposes or showcases something that it goes against gameplay or narrative, it can be quite seen as, again, immersion breaking. So not to take anything away from Resident Evil 4, because I love Resident Evil 4, aside from the fact that the merchant appears at very opportune moments and in the most bizarre places, he apparently doesn't sell ammo, despite selling guns. And the biggie here is he has stacks of ammo in his stall. Now, I imagine you can't buy ammo for certain gameplay reasons, or maybe even a design choice. Maybe the devs really want you to just bash open every wooden box that you see across the level. But when there are forum posts and even memes that contradict, there we go, about the contradiction, it may be fair to assume that players can be taken out of the experience. The issue is ultimately very hard to address, because how far is too far when it comes to being inauthentic? Can we as developers just try to internally justify layouts or architectural or even content choices that the player may find hard to understand or accept from the game's universe? Or do we just shoehorn in narrative to reinforce or motivate it when it really should be more consistent with the overall level design of your world? Like I said, these are very much subjective and circumstantial questions that are ultimately hard to answer with one clear solution. For this issue, it seems that applying credible authenticity to our games is not truly essential, but it's appreciated. Conversely, however, applying incorrect real-world knowledge doesn't make the game unrecoverable, but it can be detrimental to the player experience. Basically, do the research, gather the right reference, make sound choices when it comes to level design, and attempt to marry all of these to the game's narrative, universe, and overall vision. Can level designers overcome the challenge? Short answer, yes. Not so short answer, yes, but research and iteration must be key to the resolution. As your game slowly starts to take more form and function, the level needs to adapt to this. When do we apply or sacrifice either of these? I am yet again going to do the wishy-washy designery thing here and respond by saying, why not strive for both? As I've said before, there is almost always a balance of the two. Sometimes perfect, sometimes imperfect. But one thing is for sure is that the push and pull of the two need to align to maintain the vision and core loop of the game. If there's a disproportion between the two, but players keep in that state of flow throughout the game, utilising mechanics, exploring, and becoming immersed in your game, basically having fun, then that's great. That's most of the time that's what we set out to do. Again, similar to level design, there's no one clear solution that caters to all games for these exact issues. All games are subjective in their authenticity, with both the quality and interpretation. Resolving these issues, these very unique issues, would fall down to the team as a whole and what they feel is the best resolution for the budget and the vision of the game. I need to go forward and back. There we go. Now, back in May, I talked about this very briefly, the whiteboard test, and it's a great one-pager for immediately showing the quality expectancy for some of your levels. However, over the years of being in the industry, I found that although this is great, and I still refer to it from time to time, it doesn't apply to all games. As I've said before, level design doesn't just mean the physical space. You need to ensure nearly all aspects of the game are complemented within the level. This was originally kept in for the first draft of the talk, then I was going to get rid of it. But I wanted to keep it in as I'm hoping it's a good segue for the main focus of my talk. For a very quick example here, let's discuss the use of corridors, right? So which can be interpreted here as being somewhere between intermediate and advanced, maybe, but not exactly deemed expert. For as long as I've been learning from the industry, it's always been my understanding that corridors were bad because they either slow down gameplay, they act as a buffer or dead zone between the actual true levels of the game, and amongst other things that are fairly similar to this. I, however, see them differently. I am of the understanding that developers can use them effectively between being authentic to the space that they're in and also accommodating features of your levels. Hopefully this works. There we go. So this is a great talk by Mark Drew, and although he sees corridors as a negative, he even used the exact same example I was going to use conversely, which is PT, which is literally just two corridors. PT effectively uses horror cliches like right angle corners to see not what's around the other side, slow walk pacing to build suspense, etc. And it all worked because the developers wanted to offer a specific horror experience for the player. This was the intention, and they managed to achieve that with the help from every single department in the studio. Now, a house may not exactly be designed like this, but there is still an understanding from the player about what this space is, and it isn't too detached or inauthentic that it breaks immersion. Now, this is something I did for Games Talk Live back in May, and I thought I would do it with you here today. Different games, so there's no cheating going on. But basically, I'm going to try and show that even first or third-person shooters don't need to have overly designed complex areas. And for this specific talk, they don't even need to be insanely realistic to be authentic to the space that they're in. As long as they accommodate the gameplay that fits the loop of the game and sells people on the idea of what the level is. Does anyone know what this level is, or game is? No. I think these are actually quite hard, to be fair. So this is actually Prey from 2017, and this specific area is the Neuramod division at the start of the game. So notice how there are corridors that lead to like even open combat areas or even rooms for exploration. Similar to PT, if done right, you are strategically you can strategically offer calm before the storm moments for combat, or even jump scares that the player won't expect, whilst keeping in mind the authenticity and core loop of the level. Looking at this quote from The Guardian that discusses how Arcane shaped the game world, according to the backstory, the moon orbiting craft was originally built in the 1960s, but has been refitted many times since, most recently by the evil TranStar Corporation. It's now 2032 and the Grand Hall reflects this station's long history. Basically, there's a method here for the layout and presentation of the space, with the development team modelling this section of the ship from a 1960s interior. There we go. Even looking at other areas of the game, the lobby that's also near the start of the game, it is consistent in its level design and allows for areas of exploration, combat, and the ability to offer horror moments when the developers want to showcase a certain monster or story beat. For the lobby, the Guardian article also discusses further with Emmanuel Petit, the lead visual designer at Arcane Studios, about taking real-world inspiration. As for specific influences behind the furnishings and interior styling, Petit cites a range of real-world influences. He states, the lobby was inspired by a Spanish bank called Caja Granada. Oh, it's done that again. There we go. Caja Granada. He says, its monumental interior conveyed the feeling of power that we were looking for. Over time, it completely changed aesthetically as we drew inspiration from Art Deco interiors such as the Viceroy Hotel from New York, especially for the material. It's quite cool, and it just shows you what you can find when you do your references and do your research too. Does anyone know this game or level? Nah. So this is Battlefield 1, this Ballroom Blitz from Battlefield, which is inspired by the real-life location of Château de Chantilly in France. So notice how they take a real space and make the geometry or layout changes to make the space playable. This level shows that even some interior metrics and structures can stay the exact same, and it's the clutter within them that can adjust to accommodate gameplay. It's truly an example of authenticity, but a rare and welcome example of where a near-realistic layout or floor plan can work within the rules of the game. There we go. For the exterior, there is these vast open areas that for some developers might be seen as detrimental to the player experience. But not only are these strategically placed cover points throughout the level, but there's a reason for the large open space. Some Battlefield maps have a major focus on big team battles and even offer player vehicles, or in this particular map, horses, to operate. So what the big vehicles need, they need big space to use them in, and not only that, but big space that the players can use to leverage gameplay. Want to get to one side of the map quicker when it comes to capture the flag? Great, you can do that. Want to just stay in the combat area and just shoot people up from inside one of the light tanks? Great, you can do that. Last one. Does anyone know this map at all? Or game? Hitman. Thank God somebody got one. There we go. So this is Miami International from Hitman 2, and it's an interesting one because this level has been constructed based on internal rules that the level designers follow. They have rules for locations, rules for assassination targets, and especially rules for level design on how they construct aesthetically sound spaces that still put the gameplay at the forefront. They have a dedicated philosophy and approach that if the place seems real, then it can be accepted as such. Mehdi from Iowa Interactive was interviewed for the NoClip documentary of Hitman, and she also talks about how player expectations, bringing this back up again, of the real world help shape the design of the level. She says, what they expect is so important. It's kind of what drives us and inspires us. Like, we know what people would expect when they walk into a bank, and we really want to give them that. We also want to add an element of surprise. What's so interesting about spaces like banks or shops or airports or whatever is you know how it looks, but you've never been behind the scenes. So you kind of want to make sure that the players get that too. A lot of players have seen the vault, right? That's my daughter, don't worry about that. A lot of players have seen what a vault is, like what's in the movies and stuff like that. Expectations are super important. Here we go. Even looking at Mumbai, the Mumbai level from the same game, Matthias Engstrom, the game director, had this to say. It's all about the details, the signage, how does the pavement look, what kind of walls do they have. So we want to bring that in, and then it's not about recreating an exact location that is Mumbai, it's about finding what feels like Mumbai and building our version of that. Nothing like this exists because that would be weird, but when you're in there and you're playing it, it kind of feels natural. It kind of flows together, so it doesn't feel off when you're there. But that's just up to the level design and environment art when working together to make a space that feels believable, but still actually very gamey in a sense. You get the picture. So what I'm trying to say is, if there's anything to take away from this talk, there is no one strict rulebook when it comes to level design. You design your levels based on the needs and the vision of the game. When authenticity and gameplay marry together, it can create worlds and levels that players love to explore. If they love to fight through them too, traverse them, all these different kind of things that the level can provide. One can definitely take priority over the other, but if there's too much of a clear imbalance of the two, then that's when consistency issues arise and immersion is broken. I'll try my best to answer questions. I've never done anything like this before, but I'm more happy to connect through socials at the break or in between talks as well. I want to thank Joe for letting me do this. You see me do my one talk at Games Talk Live and thought I can do a 30-minute one, which is really cool. So thanks to Joe. Thank you all for listening. Cheers.